Okay, so we'll continue our discussion on some common characteristics of bond, preferred stock, and common stock. So maturity of the bond is very easy to understand. It just means how many periods before the bond the principal is paid back. So in general, the maturity is less than 30 years. But we do have occasionally we do have a long-term maturity which is longer than 30 years. For example, back in I believe in 1997, Disney issued a what we now call the Sleeping Beauty bond, and the maturity of that bond was 99 years. So that's a very long-term bond. And sometimes we can even have a bond which never matures. We actually talk about one example of that, which was an example of the perpetuity. Back in 1770, around that time, British government issued a council, so it never matured. Even today, they're still paying the coupon. So that's another example of a very long-term bond. But in general, the maturity is less than 30 years. So security means whether a bond has what we call the collateral pledged against it. So if a bond has a collateral, then we call that bond a secured bond. And if the bond doesn't have a collateral, then that's called unsecured or debentures. So a common type of secured bond is a mortgage bond. So mortgage bond is secured by the real property or real estate by underlying that bond. So I want to show you in class. Somehow the website didn't work, so I want to show you the website which can show the details for corporate bonds. So so click on bonds and then corporate. Suppose I want to find out Apple. Yeah, some firms they don't have bond. I believe Google may not have bond. So especially the many of the technology firms or growth firms, they may have less bond. So Apple just recently issued bond. So you can see that from this website, it's called FINRA, which stands for Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. It's basically an independent self-regulatory agency for the financial industry. So from there we can search for the information on each specific bond issued by a corporation, government, or other entities. So let me just take the first bond, which is from Apple, as an example. So click on that. Here it just gives the details. So the coupon rate, we are talking about that later. That's basically the interest rate. And going back to our topic, secure bond versus debentures. So here you can see the bond type, that's U.S. corporate debentures. So that means for Apple, this bond does not have any collateral pledged against this bond. So that's why it's debentures. And seniority means whether a bond the priority is better or is higher or lower than other bonds. So senior bonds means that these bonds are paid before the other types of bonds. So we have to link these discussions back to session 4 on risk return trade-off, high risk, high return. So if a bond is secured, which we should expect that bond should have less risky, right? It should be less risky compared with a bond which is unsecured or debentures. So from the risk return trade-off perspective, high risk, high return. So hence, if a bond is unsecured or debentures, that means this type of bond should have a lower return, or what we call a lower yield, compared with secured bonds, so mortgage bonds. And senior bonds, because they are less risky compared with junior bonds or subordinated bonds, so these bonds should offer a lower coupon rate if other things are the same, or lower return, lower yield. But I have to stress that coupon rate may not be the same as the yield. So that's why I kept saying everything else is the same. Other features are the same, like the maturity, like the risk of the bonds are the same. Then the coupon rate may serve as the return, may represent the return. Otherwise, the coupon rate may not be the return. So for example, for this Apple, this bond here, the coupon rate is 0.45%, and the return is the last trade yield here is 0.470%. But if you go to, let's say we go to Walmart and we find another bond. Okay, I want to find Walmart, so WMT. So again, this pops up a lot of different types of bonds. So suppose I want to look at the information for this bond with the yield 0.338. So you see that the coupon rate for this bond is much higher, 5.319, but the return, that's the yield here, is actually lower than this bond from Apple. So that's why I kept saying that only looking at the coupon rate, even though the Apple bond has a much lower coupon rate compared with the Walmart bond, but they have a similar, actually the Apple bond have higher yield. This stands for the return, the effective return for the investors. So one reason we can imagine to explain that is the price, right? The price compared with the par value. So if the price, because the bond investors, they not only get their coupon payment, by maturity they also get their principal back, which is the par value or face value. But when they purchase the bond, they also pay the price. So then they may have a price appreciation or depreciation over time. So that's also part of their return. So not only the coupon part, but also the price change of their holding of the bond. So you can see that the Apple stock here is the price is 99.98. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean it's $99.98. As we said, the price is just stands for as a percentage of the par value, and in general the par value is $1,000. So we should understand this to be 99.98% of the par value. But that's not very important in terms of telling the story here. So this means that the price is very close to the par value. But look at the price of the Walmart. It's much higher than the par value. So when the bond matures, the investors, if they bought the bond today, the investors will experience a value depreciation, right? That's why from that regard, the return is negative. So even though the coupon rate here is very high, but if you combine these two effects, the actual return is actually lower than the Apple bond. So using that example, I want to stress the difference between the coupon rate and the yield. And also going back to our topic of risk-return trade-off, we talk about the different hierarchy of payment for the three types of securities in this session: stocks, common stock, bond, and preferred stock. And we know that bond, among the three, bond is the least risky, right? Because they are paid before the other two types of securities, before preferred stock and common stock. That's for both when the firms is in normal operations, or what we said the going concern, or when the firms is facing bankruptcy. So in both cases, bondholders get paid first. So that's why their claims are relatively the least risky among the three. So in terms of risk-return trade-off, we should also expect that the bond return or yield of the bond should be lower than the other two types of securities, preferred stock and common stock. And then between preferred stock and common stock, we know that preferred stock, because their dividends are paid before common stock dividends, so they are also relatively less risky compared with common stock. And in terms of payment, when there is a bankruptcy, their claims are also met before the common stockholders' claims. So because they are less risky, well, in terms of the risk-return trade-off, their return should also be lower compared with the common stockholders' return. So common stock is the most junior type of security among the three, which also suggests that they are the most risky type of security. Hence, their return should also be the highest among the three. So going back to before I talk about convertible bonds, I just want to go through this like continue our topic of this return trade-off. So secure debt, here which bonds will have the higher coupon, or else equal. Again, or else equal, that's very important. As we just saw, higher coupon doesn't necessarily mean a higher yield or higher return. So here we have to be very careful. Secure debt versus a debenture. I think we just discussed that, because secure debt is less risky, so secure debt should offer a lower coupon rate. Subordinated debenture versus senior debt. And because subordinated debenture, they are more risky, so they have to offer a higher coupon rate. So going back to convertible bond. Convertible bonds means that these bonds give the bondholders an option. So by maturity date, bondholders can either receive their face value back, like for any other kind of bonds, but the convertible bonds also give the bondholders an option to receive a certain amount of typically common stock. So for example, if my if my par value face value. Let me use face value not to be confused with present value. Okay. So file value is 1,000, right? So by maturity date, I can receive this money back. But if it's let's say we have since it's a convertible bonds, so these bonds also allow me to convert my convertible bonds to 50 shares of common stock. So now I have a choice. So it's I think it's not hard to figure out that whether I want to convert depends on the stock price, right? If the stock price, the price of the stock is greater than $20, So if the price of the common stock is greater than $20 per share, which means by converting, since I can receive 50 shares, so that means that by converting I can receive more than $1,000. So then I should convert. But if the price turns out to be less than $20 per share, then I shouldn't convert, right? So that's how I should do it. But the point here is that convertible bonds gives me an option which is valuable for me, right? So in terms of the risk-return trade-off, convertible bonds should be less risky, right, compared with non-convertible bonds. Hence, in terms of the return, convertible bonds should also have a lower return or lower yield. So they should offer a lower coupon rate or else equal. And junk bond. So junk bond, to talk about junk bond, we have to talk about bond ratings. So bond ratings basically reflect the default risk of a bond. So what is the default risk? Default risk simply means that the chance that bond the borrower may not be able to pay the bond back or pay the principal or interest back. So that's the default risk. So we have three major rating agencies. Standard & Poor's, Moody's, and Fitch Ratings. So let me use the Standard & Poor's as an example to show what is the common rating grade. So the highest rating grade in the Standard & Poor's rating system is a is AAA. So and then we can have AA, and then single A, and then triple B, and double B, and single B, and triple C, double C, and finally single C. So here we have 9 major categories, and then S&P further refined these 9 categories. So they added AA plus, which is higher than AA, and then AA minus. And then we can also have single A plus and single A minus, and triple B plus and triple B minus. So go on. Double B plus and double B minus, and single B plus and single B minus. Just continue that. So any rating below this triple C minus, these are called junk bond, or more formally, actually they are called speculative grade bond, or high yield bond. So by now we should understand why it's called high yield bond, right? Because these bonds, because their ratings are high, low, so their default risk is high. So high risk, high return. Hence, their yield is also expected to be high. So that's why it's called high yield bond. And any rating above this triple B minus, and they are called investment grade bond, or low yield bond, right? For the same reason, because these bonds, their risk is lower, so their return should also be lower, low yield bond. So that's the reason for that. Okay, so now let's talk about bond valuation, right? So that's the valuation part is the most important part for this session's material. So going back to the concept of intrinsic value. Intrinsic value is the present value of all future cash flows. So in terms of a bond, the valuation of a bond is simply the present value of all future cash flows of a bond. So what is the cash flow pattern of a bond? Based on our discussion, it's categorized by constant coupon payment before maturity date, and then the final principal or the face value or par value payback. So that's the common feature of a bond, cash flow feature of a bond. So once we know the cash flows, then we need the discount rate. So we said that the discount rate is the expected rate of return, and so in this case, the expected rate of return is also called the yield to maturity, or simply yield. So then we can discount all these future cash flows by this yield to maturity to get the intrinsic value of a bond. And because based on our first discussion of the first half of this session, if investors are rational, as we assume here, the intrinsic value should be close or equal to the price. So that's why the price is also the expected, the present value of all future cash flows discounted by this yield to maturity. So because the yield to maturity is the discount rate, hence if yield to maturity increase, present value should decrease, decreases. So as the yield to maturity increase, bond price also decreases based on our discussion. And bond value basically is the sum of two parts. The first part here is basically the present value of the coupon part. So C here stands for the coupon. And you can see that basically this is the present value of annuity formula, right? Because the coupon payment is fixed and it's finite, and thus we have a maturity date. So that's annuity. And second part is the present value of the final face value or par value. So that's a single cash flow. That's the present value of that. So that's the two components of the bond value. And it turns out the second component in many cases has a much larger effect on the bond value, as we can actually show this based on an example. So example we want to talk about here is Toyota bond, maturity date of 2019, and stated coupon of 4.35%. In December 2014, with 5 years left to the maturity, so we have 5 years to go, and the yield and maturity of the bonds with similar risk is 3.6%. So the year maturity, that's the discount rate, right? Expected rate of return. So what is the value of the bond? So here it doesn't mention anything about non-annually paid coupon, so we should assume that the coupon here is paid annually. And also it doesn't mention anything about the face value. So again, by convention, face value should be $1,000. So and coupon rate, as we discussed, the coupon rate is quoted as a percentage of the par value or face value. So from this information, 4.35% coupon rate, we can determine the annual coupon should be 4.35% times $1,000. So let me draw a chart to make it easier to understand how to calculate the intrinsic value of a bond. So what happens here is that we have basically a 5-year Toyota bond. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And based on our discussion, every year the coupon is $33.5. So that's the same, continues for 5 years. And by the end of the 5th year, we are not only getting the final coupon payment, but we're also getting our par value back. So two cash flows here. And then the setup further tells us the yield to the maturity is 3.6%. So if the setup doesn't directly tell us that information, then we have to use the campaign model, CAPM, capital asset pricing model, to figure this out. Because the campaign model can tell us the expected rate of return, and then we have to know what's the systematic risk of the bond, which is the beta. We have to know the market risk premium, right? That's the based on the campaign model. That's the coefficient. That's the number which we should multiply by the beta, and then we should know the risk-free rate. From that, we can determine the expected rate of return. But here, that it's directly giving us the yield and maturity, so we can just directly use that number, 3.6%. So yield to maturity is 3.6%. So now the intrinsic value of the bond, again, that's the present value of all future expected cash flows. So in this case, the cash flows has two parts. First is the coupon. Second is the par value. Right? The coupon part is annuity. So present value of the coupon plus present value of the face value. So the coupon, as we said, that's an annuity, so we can just plug in the annuity formula, which is the payment, that's 43.5 times 1 minus 1 plus the interest rate. The interest rate here should be the discount rate, which is the yield to maturity, 3.6%. and then reach to the power of -5, right? Because we are calculating the present value, so the power here needs to be a negative number. And then everything divided by the discount rate, 3.6%. So that's basically the first part, the present value of the coupon part. And then the second part, present value of the face value. Face value is $1,000. And then times 1 plus the interest rate, the discount rate, 3.6%, raised to the power of -5, right? Because this takes place in year 5. So if you do plug in these numbers into your calculator, you can find out this is 195 point. Just to save some time, let me just directly directly give the number 195.85, and the second component here, that's 837.92. So their sum becomes the final answer. The intrinsic value of the bond is $1,033.77. So I want to point out here, if you compare these two numbers, obviously this second component, which is the present value of the face value, is much larger than the first component, which is the present value of the coupon part. So that's why previously I mentioned among the two components of the bond value, typically the second component, which is the present value of the face value, is much larger. So in other words, most of the bond value is driven by the second component, which is the face value part. And that can help us to understand the two of the four relationships on bond valuation, as we will talk about later. So this is the annually compounded coupon case, annually paid coupon case. But sometimes, actually the most common case is not annually paid coupon. It is the semi-annual coupon payment, as we just mentioned. So if we have a semi-annual coupon payment, how can we solve this kind of question? So this is the example. Let me just copy that to my OneNote, just to save some effort. Copy that here. Oh, that seems to have some problem. Okay, so I just copied that question to my OneNote, so we don't have to switch back and forth to save some time. So coupon rate is 14%, but it's a semi-annual coupons, and yield to maturity is 16%. So keep in mind that without specifically mentioning, we should always assume all these numbers are annual numbers. So the yield to maturity here should also be an annual return. But now, since the coupon is paid semi-annually, so we should work with the semi-annual numbers. So that means we should divide this by 2 to get the semi-annual yield to maturity, which means the semi-annual yield to maturity is 8%, and maturity is 7 years. So again, we need to work with the semi-annual numbers, which means we should work with 7 times 2, which is 14 semi-annuals. But do we have to do anything with for par value? No. For par value, we just keep the same number because par value is just one single cash flow. So putting that into our so the coupon into the framework, the coupon should be the semi-annual coupon, which means it should be $70. And the yield maturity, we should work with the semi-annual, which is 8%. And the T should be 14, right? Semi-annuals is semi-annuals. So then when we plug in these numbers, the value, the intrinsic value of the bond, again, that's the present value of the coupon plus present value of the face value. So now plug in the numbers. The present value of the coupon, that's an annuity. The payment is 70, semi-annual coupon payment, times 1 minus 1 plus, now semi-annual yield maturity, so that's 8%, and this to the power of negative 14, right, because we are working with semi-annual numbers, and then over the semi-annual yield maturity. So that's the first part, and the second part, again, the face value is $1,000. We don't have to do anything there. And then 1 plus the semi-annual yield maturity, reach the power of negative 14. So you can put this into a calculator and get a final answer. To save time, I just get my final answer is 917.56. Alright, so that's for the bond valuation part. So now let's talk about, based on the bond valuation, we can summarize what we call the 4 relationships on bond valuation. So relationship 1, we talk about that the yield maturity, because that's the discount rate. So the higher yield maturity should be associated with a lower value and hence a lower price. And because the yield maturity is further positively associated with the interest rate. So interest rate here refers to the risk-free rate, right? So the Federal Reserve basically can decide the risk-free rate. So if that rate goes up, in general, the yield maturity also should go up. And then yield maturity going up, we know that the bond value generally should drop. So relationship 1 on bond valuation simply tells us there's an inverse relationship between interest rate and the bond value or bond price. So the blank here should be the value of the bond decreases, and within the percentages should be increases. So that's relationship 1. So it's a very general relationship. And relationship 2 is trying to go further than relationship 1. It's based on relationship 1 but goes further. So relationship 2 is trying to tell us the range or the cutoff value for the bond price, and depending on the yield maturity. So if the yield, the maturity is higher than the coupon rate, so based on the first relationship, we know that the yield maturity is higher, hence the bond price should be lower. But how much lower? So then the bond price should be lower than the par value. So that's the cutoff point for the bond price. If the yield maturity is greater than the coupon rate, then bond price is lower than the par value. So in that case, because bond price is traded at a lower price than par value, we call that type of bond to be a discount bond. And in contrast, if the yield maturity is lower than the coupon rate, based on the first relationship, we should have an inverse relationship to the bond price. So now bond price should be higher, but how much higher? Should be higher than the par value. So in that case, it's called a premium bond. And finally, if the yield maturity is exactly the same as the coupon rate, So in that case, the bond price is also exactly the same as the par value. So we call that case to be trade at par. So now let's go back to the example we just looked at, Apple versus Walmart, the two bonds. So Apple, you can see the bond, the trade price, even it's a lower, right? It's a slightly lower than the par value. We said that the price here means it's a fraction, it's a percentage of the par value. So 99.98% of the par value, which means it's lower, but it's very close. So look at the yield. That's the yield and maturity compared with the coupon rate. So yield and maturity is higher than the coupon rate. Right? That's consistent with our the second relationship, but it's very close. So it's also consistent with the second relationship. If the price turns out to be exactly the same as the par value, hence this becomes 100, then we should expect this number, the yield, to be exactly the same as the coupon rate. So then what happens to the Walmart bond? So in this case, the trade price is above the par value. So that's a premium bond. So premium bond, the yield should be lower than the coupon rate. And that's the case, right? The yield is much lower than the coupon rate. So we just use these two examples to basically have confirmed the relationship 2. And finally, the last two relationships, 3 and 4, 3 is talking about how does the maturity of the bond depend on how does the interest rate risk of the bond depend on the maturity. So interest rate risk means that if interest rate goes up, well, based on the first relationship, we know that if the interest rate goes up, bond price should fall. So this interest rate actually poses as a certain type of risk for the bondholders, right? If the interest rate goes up, they know that their value will drop. So it's type of a risk for them, and that's why we call that the interest rate risk. But the interest rate risk will be different depending on the maturity. And the relationship 3 says that the longer maturity bonds, they have a higher interest rate risk. And further, the interest rate risk also depends on the coupon. So that's the relationship 4, which says that the lower coupon bonds have a higher interest rate risk. So how do we understand the intuition for these two relationships? We have to go to our calculation which we just did. So we know from this calculation that most of the bond value is driven by the final face value, but the final face value occurs in the distant future. Hence, it will be heavily discounted back to obtain its present value. So hence, the discount rate will have a dramatic or significant effect on this final component. But based on our discussion, this turns out to be the most important determinant of the bond value. So that also suggests the discount rate will have a dramatic effect on the bond value, and because interest rate is a component of the discount rate, so interest rate risk will also be higher if the maturity is higher, because the maturity simply suggests how severe the discounting will take place, right? If the maturity is higher, that means the future, the par value, will be brought back to the present with a more number of periods. hence the discounting becomes more severe, hence the discount rate will have a larger impact on this component. In other words, the bond value will be more sensitive to the change in that discount rate. So that's why the long-term bonds, they have a higher interest rate risk compared with short-term bonds. And for the same reason, if the bond offers a lower coupon rate, so that means a larger portion of the bond value should be driven by the second component, which is the face value. Because the first component, because of the lower coupon, so the first component also will have a smaller impact on the bond value. Hence, for the same reason, because of the heavy discounting, the change in the discount rate, which is further dependent on the change in the interest rate, will also have a more dramatic effect on the bond value because of this second component. So that's the rationale behind these two relationships. So that's for the bond valuation. And now let's get to the stock valuation. So for stock, bond pays the coupon, and for stock, we know that stockholders can receive dividends, right? So not only dividends, stockholders can also receive the expected price when they sell the stock in the future. If they decide to hold the stock for 1 year, and after 1 year they sell the stock, then in 1 year they are not only getting a year one's dividend, but they also can receive some cash by selling that stock at the price that they expect in year one. So as with bonds, the price or intrinsic value of the stock is simply the present value of all future cash flows, right? But the cash flows here is simply the dividends and the future expected price they can expect to sell at some future date. So now let's use two examples to see how do we actually calculate this price or intrinsic value of a stock. So suppose you are thinking of purchasing the stock of Moore Oil. You expected to pay a $2 dividend in 1 year, and you believe that you can sell the stock for $14 at that time. If you require a return of 20% on investments of this risk, what is the maximum you would be willing to pay? So for any questions, I would recommend you to draw a chart like what I'm doing here. So if you draw a chart, potentially you can have a better understanding of what's going on. So here we have basically one period. It's very simple. So 0 and 1. And both cash flows occurs at year 1. So we can receive dividends. And dividend equals to $2 per share. And besides that, we can also expect to get some money by selling the stock, and that price is $14. And based on the risk of this stock, the information also says the expected return is 20%. Right? That's the required return. And we know that's our discount rate. So intrinsic value of the stock, VS, let's see, is simply the present value of all future cash flows. And in this case, this all future cash flows simply refer to these two cash flows. Right? That's all the cash flows we have. Dividend at year 1 and expected price at year 1. So now translating that into the formula here, the present value of all future cash flows is simply the dividend at year 1 discounted to present, which is 1 plus R, and then plus the expected price at year 1 discounted back to present. So now plug in the number. $2 dividend for year 1 divided 1 plus 20% plus $14 divided by 1 plus 20%. So eventually you will have $13.33. So that's the 1 period example. So now let's work with this 2 period example. Right? So suppose the investor wants to hold the stock for 2 years instead of just 1 year, as we just looked at. So now, let's say they expect a dividend, in addition to the dividend, same dividend in year 1, which is $2 per share. They also expect a dividend of $2.10 in 2 years, and a stock price of $14.70 at the end of the year 2. So that's what they expect to sell by the year 2. So how much would you be willing to pay? So now let's just simply extend this chart. Okay. So I need to erase this in order to, okay, so I need to extend this chart by 1 more year, since we have 2 periods now. So now at year 2 I can expect to receive a second dividend, and this is $2.10. And in addition to that, I can sell my stock at another price, and the price I expect to sell is $14.70. So those are the new cash flows I have. But the calculation, but in principle, the intrinsic value is still the present value of all future cash flows. So now, let me just save some time, just directly write down future cash flows. So now the future cash flows has 3 parts, right? The cash flow at year 1, which is dividend 1, and cash flows at year 2, which has 2 cash flows, the dividend at year 2 and the expected price at year 2. So we have 3 cash flows altogether. Those are all the cash flows of this stock. So dividend over 1 plus R, D1 over 1 plus R plus D2, dividend for year 2 over 1 plus R square, right? And then plus the price for year 2 over 1 plus R square. Hence, just plug in the numbers, $2 divided by 1 plus 20% plus $2.10 divided by 1 plus 20% square, and plus $14.70 divided by 1 plus 20% square. And then plugging all these numbers into your calculator, you will find out the answer will be the same, $13.33. So you can further extend the holding period into more distant future, right? Instead of holding this for 2 years, you can hold it for 3 years, 4 years, or even 50 years. So that gives rise to what we call the dividend growth model. So if you can imagine that by extending the holding period in the infinite distant future, basically all the cash flows for a stockholder are dividends. There's no longer a final setting price, right? Because basically the shareholder simply decides to hold the stock forever. So that's their only cash flow is the dividend. So then in terms of the valuation, we just need to blend all these future dividends back to present to get the intrinsic value of the stock. So that's the idea we do when we do the valuation for stocks. And then for stocks, we know that we further have preferred stock and common stock. So they have different cash flow patterns or dividend patterns. Preferred stock, because their dividend basically is fixed. So and since it continues forever based on our discussion. So the price can be computed using this perpetuity formula, right? We talk about that in session 3. And for the common stock, dividends is no longer fixed, but we said that dividend typically increases grows with the growth of earnings, and earnings further grows with the growth of the firm. And hence, if the dividend grows with the earnings, so we don't have a perpetuity anymore, but we can have this so-called growing perpetuity. And the formula for the present value of a growing perpetuity turns out to be very simple as well. So now let's first work with the perpetuity preferred stock case. So we said that this is a perpetuity, so we know that the present value of a perpetuity is simply the payment. So that's the dividend here divided by the expected return, and that's the discount rate. And so let's look at this example. Suppose a preferred stock is expected to pay a 50 cents dividend every quarter. So notice here we're working with the quarterly number, right? So we need to convert all these inputs into the quarterly values. So and the required return is 10% with quarterly compounding. So again, 10% here should be the quoted rate. So we need to convert that rate into the quarterly rate. So by dividing by that by 4, which means the quarterly required rate of return should be 2.5%. So what is the price? So I think this can be easily determined by 50. Basically, let me just write down in my PowerPoint slides. This should be 0.50 divided by, based on our discussion, 2.5%, which gives us the $20 per share for the intrinsic value of a preferred stock. So intrinsic value of a common stock, as we said, common stock dividends are not fixed, but they grow with the growth of earnings. And we assume the growth of earnings is this small g. So then we have a growing perpetuity formula, which is this formula right here. So the price of common stock equals this D1, which is the dividend for next period, divided by the expected return for common stock, R, minus that growth rate of dividend or growth rate of earnings, which is the same. And since dividend grows at this small g, so D1 also has a relationship to D0, which is D1 equals D0 times 1 plus small g. So that's why we also have this part of the formula. So very importantly, notice here we need D1, not D0. Yeah, if we have D0, we have to multiply that number by 1 plus g. Basically, that gives us D1. So ultimately, we need D1 in the formula. But sometimes the information simply gives you D0. then you have to get D1 to answer to calculate the value. So now let's look at some examples. Suppose Big D just paid a dividend of 50 cents per share. So here I highlighted these words, just paid. Just paid means that it's not for the future, right? Because D1 has to be talking about something in the future. So if the problem tells you D1, it has to say something like the firm is expected to pay a dividend, or the firm will pay a dividend, things like that. But here, the setup says that the firm just paid a dividend of 50 cents per share. So that means it's D0. D0 equals 50 cents. And it is expected to increase its dividend by 2% per year. So here 2% is the growth rate of dividend, which means it's a small g. Small g equals 2%. If the market requires a return of 15% on assets of this risk, how much should the stock be selling for? So return is 15%, that's our discount rate. So putting the numbers into the right place, and based on our discussion, what's directly given is D0. So D0 is 50 cents, and growth rate of dividend, that's 2%, and the expected return, that's 15%. So if we go back to the formula, the CS, the intrinsic value of common stock, CS here stands for the common stock. If we go back to the formula, which is the P, the same as the P here. So we said because investors are rational, so the price should be the same as the intrinsic value. So that equals D1, right? D1, it's dividend for next period over R minus G. But what's directly given is D0. But we know that the relationship between D0 and D1 is that D1 equals D0 times 1 plus G. Hence we can plug in this into our formula, and R minus G. So now, plugging all these numbers, it's 50 cents times 1 plus 2%, and divided by 15% minus 2%. So ultimately we should have 3. So let me double check whether that's correct answer. Should be 3.92. It's not oh, I erased too much. This is 3.92. Okay, so that's the intrinsic value of this stock. And going back to the example, another example is suppose TV Pirates is expected to pay a $2 dividend in 1 year. So from this sentence, we know that now D1 equals $2. Right? If the dividend is expected to grow at 5% per year and the required return is 20%, what is the price? So now since D1 equals $2, so then we can determine that relatively straightforwardly. So it's D1 divided by R minus G, and D1 that's $2 per share, and R based on the setup is 20%, and G that's 5%. So it's 20% minus 5%. So this will give us $13.33. So you can see that this number is the same as what we calculated earlier based on the two examples, one period example and two period example. And that's no coincidence. Basically, the setup of this example here matches the setup here. If you calculate the price of year one, expected price of year one, based on the setup here, you will notice that the expected price of year one is simply $14 per share. So that's why this setup here, all future dividends are the same as the setup here. Here is just telling us the expected future price rather than all future dividends. But based on all future dividends, expected price of year one has to be $14. And expected price of year two has to be $14.70. Actually, if you calculate the growth rate of this price, you will see that the growth rate of the price, basically that's the capital gains. Capital gain is the same as the growth rate of dividend, which is 5%. Alright, so I believe that's it for the discussion today for the session 5 materials. So in the rest of the time, I also want to talk about which I think I forgot to mention this when we talk about some real world bond like Apple and Walmart. So let's go over some details with the knowledge we just learned. For Apple, we know the coupon rate, maturity date, and the yield. Here also has the debentures, right, which means it's unsecured. There's no collateral pledged against this bond, and it's a you can see the payment frequency is a semi-annual, and we said that's the most common type of frequency. And you can also see the ratings. You can see it has the Moody's rating and the S&P's rating. It doesn't have the Fitch rating. So it doesn't have to have all these three agencies rating. Basically, only one is sufficient. It's a triple A or double A plus, which means it's one grade lower than the best grade triple A, but still is very good. And obviously that's an investment grade, and it's a senior note. It's a senior note, so we know that senior means that these bonds are paid before other types of bonds, and note here is another way to state the maturity. So note means the maturity is between 1 year and 10 years, and if the maturity is over 10 years, we call that a bond. But in this course, actually we use a bond in a more generic sense. So bond refers to any type of debt, so regardless of the maturities. But in corporate world, many times people use bond to refer to a debt with more than 10-year maturity. And note here means that the maturity is between 1 year and 10 years. And if the maturity is less than 1 year, that's called bill. So treasury bill means that the maturity is less than 1 year. So that's basically what we can gather from these details. So Apple stock or Apple bond, that's an investment grade bond, and that's a double A plus. And what about Walmart? Walmart is double A, which is one notch lower than the Apple bond, but still very good, and that's also investment grade. So can we find some speculative grade or junk bonds? Yeah, let's try Radio Shack. We know that Radio Shack just filed bankruptcy, so I expect bonds of Radio Shack should have a very low grade. So let's find out whether that's the case. So if I go down here, you see that Fitch rating, that's C, and S&P's rating, that's even D. D here means it's already in default. So the payment frequency is also semi-annual. But look at the yield. The yield is 88.113%. So you see that the very high risk of Radio Shack bond is also associated with a very high return. I also want to show you briefly how can we get the real-world information about preferred stock and common stock. For preferred stock, you can go to Yahoo Finance, and for common stock, Yahoo Finance too. So for preferred stock, for example, I want to find out Goldman Sachs, the preferred stocks. I just type the ticker number for Goldman Sachs, GS, and then dash, and then if I choose the first one, which is the preferred stock C, that's the series C preferred stock. So then you can look at the trading information. The price of the stock today is going down by 0.34%. And if you want to find out more details, then you can go to this website called preferredstockchannel.com, and so search for Goldman Sachs. Here I already searched for Goldman Sachs, and so I can just so this is basically the series C, more detailed information about this preferred stock. So for common stock, you can go to a lot of public websites, and this probably is the easiest to find information, a type of security. So if I want to know the common stock information for Microsoft, so Microsoft, the ticker is MSFT, so just enter that, or you can search by name, that's fine. So this is the common stock for Microsoft. The price is going up by 0.67% today. And by the way, I also want to mention that last session we talked about beta. That's the measure of the systematic risk. And beta is could be commonly found in many popular finance websites, including the Yahoo Finance. You see the beta for Microsoft is 0.79%. And based on discussion in last week's radio lecturing, we know that this beta is less than 1, and which means the systematic risk of Microsoft is lower than the average stock in the market, because the beta for the market as a whole is 1. Right? So here it's less than 1. So that's how we find information for preferred stock and the common stock. And then I want to talk about, I'll give you some brief hints about how to solve some questions in this session's homework, which is homework 4. So question number 5, it says that this company just paid a dividend. So based on our discussion for our PowerPoint slides and examples, we know that this means is D0 equals $1.80, right? So don't confuse this with a D1. Then you can solve this question. And second part is, what will the stock price be in 3 years? So that formula, the intrinsic value of the stock, if we go back to the formula, the P0 equals D1 over 1 R minus G. So here P does not necessarily have to be the price today, which is 0. So if you have price 3 years later, so you can simply change this D1 to be D4. So as long as the dividend starts from next period, so if you're calculating the price of year 3, so then the next period should be the year 4's dividend. So this is D4 divided by R minus G. So that's how we can solve this question. Stock price in 3 years should be the dividend in year 4 divided by R minus G. And similar for the stock price in 16 years. So that's question number 5. And question number 6. Here the firm will pay a $2.94 per share dividend next year. So that means it's D1 equals $2.94. And then question number 7. So the firm pays a constant dividend $9.80 on stock, and the company will maintain this dividend for the next 14 years, and will then cease paying dividends forever. And then they also give the required return and what is the current share price. So unlike the case we talked about in class, here the dividend only lasts for 14 years. So it's no longer a perpetuity, right? Rather it is an annuity, because the number of payments is finite. So other than that, we can solve this question also relatively straightforwardly by using the present value of an annuity rather than the present value of a perpetuity to solve this question. So that's question number 7. Question number 8. So this firm is a young startup company. No dividends will be paid on the stock over the next 9 years, because the firm needs to plow back its earnings to fuel growth. The company will pay a $15 per share dividend in 10 years, and will increase the dividend by 5% per year thereafter. And if the required return is 10.5%, what is the current share price? So this question, the difference between this question and the examples we look at in the PowerPoint slides is that the first dividend does not start from year 1. Rather, it starts from year 10. But other than that, it's the same. So how can we solve this type of question? Again, I made a video recording on solving some homework questions for homework 2 on the time value of money, that session. So we have a similar question there, right? The first payment, some annuity question, the first payment of the annuity doesn't start from next year, it just starts from some years later. So we said one skill or one trick we can solve this type of question that we can move our base point to the date which makes the first payment to start from next year. So from that regard, we can make the base date to be year 9. Hence, the first payment will start from year 10. And that's our D1. So then we can figure out the present value of this stock at year 9. But once we know that present value, then we can bring that value back to the true present, P0, at date 0, to get the intrinsic value of the stock at year 0. So that's how we can solve this question. As we said, it's the similar trick as what we did for some homework questions in homework 2. So for details, you can refer to my lecture recording, video recording on how to solve that question back to homework 2. So then question number 9. Here, the stock currently sells for $25 per share. So that means the price is $25 or intrinsic value is $25 per share, and it requires return is 10.4%. And if the company maintains a constant 3.2% growth rate in dividends, what was the most recent dividend per share paid on the stock? So this question is based on the same formula as this formula. The price of the stock depends on the dividend next year divided by R minus G. But now it's solving for a different unknown. So typically we know the dividend, and we know the price, or we know the expected return, we know the growth rate. We're trying to figure out the price. But now the price actually is provided. The price is provided. And then the G is provided, and the R is also provided. What's unknown is what the question is asking is basically D0, right? What was the most recent dividend per share paid? So that's basically asking for this D0. But since all the other numbers are known, so you can solve out D0. This is a one unknown, one equation system. So you can solve out D0. So that's how you can solve this question. And finally, question number 10. This question is similar to question number 8 we just talked about. The difference here is that instead of having a annuity, here we have a perpetuity. So here we have a preferred, instead of having a common stock, here we have a preferred stock. So we have an annual dividend of $15 in perpetuity, but notice here the dividend starts from 20 years later. So we know the return, required return, that's the discount rate, and how much does a share of a preferred stock cost today. So again, to use that formula, the perpetuity formula, we have to make sure the first payment starts from next year. Here, the first payment starts from 20 years later. So again, the trick is to move the base 9. Move the base date to year 19. Hence, the first payment starts from next year. So we can figure out the present value of the preferred stock in terms of year 19. Then we can bring that present value back to the true present by discounting for 19 years, right? So that's how we can solve this question. Okay, so I hope this lecturing and my hints of solving the homework questions can help you better understand the concepts, and also can help you to better be able to solve all these questions. And that's it for the discussion today.